Somewhere in the patent archives of the 19th century, there is a description of an engine that lit itself without a single open flame. No match, no spark, no pilot light in any conventional sense. Just a slender coil of platinum heated to a quiet, ghostly incandescence, enough to ignite a charge of vapor and air and set a piston moving. The men who examined this machine in 1846 would have called it remarkable. Today, most people have never heard of it at all. The inventor was a New Yorker named Stuart Perry. On October 7th, 1846, the United States Patent Office granted him patent number 4800 for what the official record described as an improvement in gas engines. The language of the patent is measured and technical, the kind of careful prose that engineers of that era used when they wanted their ideas protected without being so specific that a competitor could simply read around them. But beneath the formal wording, what Perry had designed was genuinely unusual. A water-jacketed, double-acting horizontal engine that used vaporized fuel, mixed it with atmospheric air, and touched it off not with a naked flame, but with a piece of platinum brought to incandescence by heat alone. The result was a faint, controlled glow rather than a burning wick or an open burner, and it was enough. It is worth pausing here to be precise about a phrase, because precision matters when the historical record is thin. The term cold light, which lends this story part of its strangeness, does not appear in Perry's original patent text. It is a modern interpretive label drawn from the scientific literature of the period that surrounded him. Natural philosophers and early chemists in the 1840s were fascinated by the behavior of platinum, a metal capable of catalyzing combustion in surrounding gases, while itself glowing with only the faintest visible light, a phenomenon sometimes described in lectures and popular science writing as cold light to distinguish it from the roaring visible flames of ordinary combustion. When Perry's engine is described that way today, it is because his platinum igniter fits neatly into that category of phenomenon, not because he used those words himself. The distinction matters. History has a way of acquiring labels that feel more certain than the underlying evidence actually supports. What Perry did submit to the Patent Office, alongside his drawings and his written claims, was a physical model. This was not unusual for the time. For most of the 19th century, the United States patent system required inventors to provide working models as a condition of their applications, small, functional demonstrations, generally built to fit within a box roughly a foot in each dimension that examiners could handle, turn, and in some cases actually operate. The requirement existed because drawings could be misleading, claims could be vague, and a machine that worked in theory sometimes didn't work at all. A model that moved, that had correctly fitted parts, that demonstrated the basic mechanical relationships of the invention, that was evidence of a different order. It was proof of a kind of seriousness. Perry's submitted model was logged as measuring approximately 11 inches by 27 inches by 6 inches, a compact but apparently complete representation of the engine's essential systems. Patent office models accumulated over the decades into enormous collections, thousands of small machines lining the shelves of the patent building in Washington, and they became something of a public attraction. Citizens could walk through and see the ingenuity of their era arranged in miniature. Some of those models eventually found their way into museum collections. Some were lost in fires. Some were sold in government auctions when storage became a problem. Perry's model made it at least as far as a 1939 Smithsonian catalog, where it was documented in the National Museum's Mechanical Collections Bulletin as a cataloged object. And then, at some point after that entry, it appears to have quietly vanished, not destroyed in any documented sense, not transferred to any recorded location, simply gone from display, its current whereabouts unknown. That disappearance is one of the two questions at the center of this story. The other is more fundamental. How exactly did this engine work? Perry's patent gives us the architecture, the water jacket around the cylinder, the fuel retort, the mixing of vapor and air, the platinum coil and its valve, the double-acting stroke. But it tells us almost nothing about performance. There are no horsepower figures, no efficiency claims, no record of how long the engine ran or under what conditions it was tested. Contemporary observers who saw it noted that combustion appeared to occur over roughly 1/3 of the piston's stroke, a detail logged and cited decades later, but beyond that the operational record is sparse. Whether the engine was loud or quiet, whether it ran smoothly or knocked, whether Perry himself believed it had commercial promise or regarded it as an experimental step, none of that has survived in any form that can be confirmed. What survives is the patent document and its drawings, the brief catalog entry, and the fact that the engine predates, by more than a decade, the machines that most historians identify as the founding achievements of the internal combustion era. The Lenoir engine, widely cited as the first commercially successful gas engine, came in 1860. Lenoir Otto's work came later still. Perry was there in 1846, building something that fits into that same lineage, quietly, in New York, with a coil of glowing platinum and a design that almost no one remembers. Understanding why it was forgotten requires understanding first how it worked, and understanding what was lost requires reckoning with the strange fate of a small model, carefully built, once logged in a government catalog, and then gone. The patent drawings for Perry's engine are not elaborate. They are the clean, spare diagrams of a man who understood that examiners valued clarity over artistry. A few ruled lines, some labeled parts, the kind of mechanical illustration that rewards careful study rather than casual glancing. But if you follow those lines with patience and read the written claims alongside them, a picture assembles itself. Not a complete picture. Patent language was never intended to be a maintenance manual, but enough of one to understand what Perry believed he had built and why the design was unusual enough to warrant protecting. Begin with the basic configuration. Perry's engine is horizontal, meaning the cylinder lies on its side rather than standing upright, which was already a meaningful choice in 1846. Horizontal orientation tends to place less gravitational stress on a piston and its seals, and it allows for a lower, more stable machine overall. More importantly, the engine is double-acting, which means that combustion occurs on both sides of the piston alternately. The piston is pushed in one direction, then pushed back in the other, each stroke producing useful work. This is not unusual in the history of steam engines, or double-acting cylinders had been common for decades, but applying that same logic to an internal combustion cycle was a more complicated proposition. You need to introduce fuel and air to both ends of the cylinder, manage ignition at both ends, and exhaust the spent gases from both sides, all in coordinated sequence. The mechanical demands are not trivial. Wrapped around that cylinder is a water jacket. Water circulates in the space between the inner cylinder wall and an outer casing, keeping the metal from building up heat that would otherwise degrade the piston's seals, warp the bore, or cause the incoming fuel mixture to ignite prematurely. This is, in broad outline, the same principle that governs every water-cooled engine built since. What makes Perry's arrangement more interesting is that the water does not simply cool and leave. It performs two additional functions that are built into the design as deliberate features rather than incidental effects. The first of those additional functions is lubrication. The patent describes water being used to lubricate the piston and its rod, which would strike a modern engineer as unusual. Water is not a lubricant in any conventional sense, and introducing it to a combustion cylinder raises its own complications. But in 1846, before the development of refined petroleum oils, the options for lubricating a hot-running cylinder were limited, and Perry apparently found water's cooling properties useful enough to justify this role alongside the dedicated lubrication fluids that were available. Whether this arrangement worked smoothly in practice, or whether it created more problems than it solved, is not something the patent record addresses. That kind of operational knowledge, the kind that accumulates through hours of running a machine and adjusting it, was not what inventors typically documented. The second additional function is more elegant. The same water that circulates around the cylinder is also used to heat the fuel retort. The retort is a separate component, a small vessel connected to the engine's fuel system, in which a liquid fuel, turpentine is the example most often cited in connection with Perry's design, though other volatile liquids would have been candidates, is gradually vaporized into a combustible gas. Generating vapor from liquid fuel requires heat, and rather than introducing a separate heat source for this purpose, Perry directed the engine's own cooling water, which by the time it has circulated around the cylinder has absorbed considerable heat, to serve as the heating medium for the retort. The waste heat of combustion, in other words, is used to prepare the next charge of fuel. It is a heat exchange arrangement, not unlike principles that would become central to engineering efficiency a century later, and it is notable enough that it appears as the specific design claim rather than an afterthought. Once the retort has vaporized the liquid fuel into a combustible gas, that gas does not go directly into the cylinder. It first mixes with atmospheric air in proportions that would allow it to burn properly. This mixing stage matters because fuel vapor alone, without sufficient oxygen, will not combust reliably, and too much air will dilute the mixture below its ignition threshold. Perry's patent describes this mixing as occurring before the mixture enters the cylinder, a pre-mixing arrangement which is conceptually closer to a carbureted engine than to the direct injection systems that came much later. The exact mechanism by which the proportions were controlled is one of the places where the patent language becomes less specific than a modern reader might wish. Some latitude was likely left to the operator's judgment or to the self-regulating tendencies of the fuel supply pressure and the valve timing. It is the ignition system that makes the engine genuinely distinctive. Inside the cylinder, or positioned to communicate with it, is a piece of platinum, a coil or strip of the metal that has been heated to incandescence. Platinum, uniquely among the common metals of the era, is capable of acting as a catalytic surface, encouraging combustion in surrounding flammable gases while itself glowing with a faint, almost colorless light, rather than an open flame. The practical effect is that the platinum, once brought to sufficient temperature, will ignite a passing charge of fuel-air mixture without any flame being visible in the conventional sense. A valve in the design allows the platinum to be exposed to the incoming mixture at the appropriate moment in the cycle or isolated from it when ignition is not desired. Open the valve, the hot platinum meets the vapor-air charge, combustion begins. Close it, and the platinum is shielded while the gases are being exchanged and a new charge prepared. The timing of this valve was presumably tied to the engine's mechanical cycle, though the patent does not specify the linkage in complete detail. What the available sources do record is something about how combustion behaved once it was initiated. The 1939 Smithsonian catalog entry, drawing on earlier documentation, notes that combustion in Perry's engine was observed to last for approximately 1/3 of the piston's stroke. This is worth considering carefully because it is one of the only operational details that survived the engine's disappearance into institutional storage. If accurate, it suggests that the burning of the fuel-air charge was not instantaneous and explosive in the way that a sharp detonation would be, but rather a more measured propagation of flame through the cylinder volume during the early portion of each stroke. The remainder of the stroke, roughly 2/3 of it, would then be driven by the expanding combustion gases as they push the piston without additional burning occurring. This kind of staged expansion, if that is what it was, would have moderated the peak pressures inside the cylinder and reduced the amount of heat transferred directly into the cylinder walls during the power stroke. Whether Perry designed this deliberately or whether it was a consequence of his ignition and fuel mixture characteristics is not something the patent explains. But the practical effect, assuming the observation is reliable, is consistent with where the water jacket may have been sufficient to keep the engine running at manageable temperatures. The cylinder was never being asked to absorb the full thermal shock of an instantaneous explosion on every stroke. It is important to be honest about what this analysis rests on. The patent drawings give us geometry. The written claims give us intention. The catalog note about combustion duration gives us one observer's measurement. There are no test records, no engineering reports, no accounts from Perry himself about how the engine performed over a sustained run. What we are doing in reconstructing how this machine worked is reading the architecture of a documented design and inferring its logic, which is a different thing from knowing it. Perry built something real enough to submit as a working model to the patent office. Whether it ran well, whether it ran long, and whether it could have been made practical at any useful scale are questions that the surviving record simply does not answer. If we stop there, with geometry and water jackets and a coil of glowing platinum, Perry's engine can feel like an isolated curiosity, the contrivance of one mechanically minded New Yorker working a little ahead of his neighbors. It becomes more interesting when you place it on a timeline. By the time Stuart Perry filed his patent in 1846, the idea of burning something inside a cylinder to move a piston was not new, but it was not yet respectable either. A generation earlier, in Switzerland, François Isaac de Rivaz had built a clumsy vertical engine that used a hydrogen-oxygen mixture ignited by an electric spark to drive a piston upward. It was a single-shot device, more than a continuous engine, and it never evolved into anything commercially useful, but it did prove that internal explosion could replace external steam as a source of mechanical push. In the United States, Samuel Morey had experimented with gas and vapor engines as early as the 1820s. His designs mixed turpentine vapor or other combustible gases with air and ignited them to drive a piston, and he even mounted one on a boat as a demonstration. Morey earned patents and some local notice, but no enduring market followed. His engines were awkward, the fuels were inconvenient, and steam, with its boilers and iron pipes, already had an entrenched infrastructure and a workforce that understood it. In Britain, William Barnett, working in the 1830s, was among the first to describe something that begins to sound like a modern gas engine. His patents include mechanisms for compressing a gas-air mixture before ignition and for keeping the combustible charge separated from the flame until the right moment. These are ideas that modern engine designers would recognize immediately. Mixture preparation, controlled ignition, the search for repeatable cycles rather than one-off blasts. Perry steps into this landscape about a decade later. His patent is dated October 7th, 1846. The canonical engines that most histories point to, Etienne Lenoir's double-acting gas engine of 1860 and the atmospheric engine developed by Lenoir Otto and Eugen Langen in the mid-1860s, are still over the horizon. Lenoir's machine, working off-city illuminating gas, would be sold in quantities and installed in workshops. Otto's later four-stroke design in 1876 would set the pattern for what we now casually call an Otto cycle engine. By comparison, Perry's device seems to belong to an earlier, more tentative era, and yet, lined up in chronological order, the dates tell a slightly different story. Perry's patent predates Lenoir by roughly 14 years, and Otto's earliest gas engine work by close to 18. If you strip away the mythological weight that those later names have acquired, you find Perry experimenting with a water-cooled, double-acting cylinder, feeding it with fuel vapor generated from liquid, and igniting that mixture without an open flame, at a time when many of his contemporaries were still letting explosive mixtures expand against gravity in single strokes or heating external boilers. The word ahead can be treacherous in technology history. It invites a kind of present-day grading rubric that inventors of the 1840s neither knew nor cared about. But in two respects at least, Perry's design does look forward rather than sideways. One is the way he treats water, not simply as an afterthought to keep metal from cracking, but as an integrated part of the fuel system. His jacketed cylinder sheds heat into circulating water. That same warmed water then serves as a heat bath for the fuel retort, vaporizing the next charge. Modern engineers would call this recuperation or waste heat utilization. In 1846, Perry simply writes it into his claims as though it were an obvious convenience. The other is fuel handling itself. Instead of relying on manufactured town gas delivered through a pipe, as Lenoir would do, Perry begins with a liquid, something like turpentine, and turns it into combustible vapor on site. That makes his engine, at least in principle, more self-contained. It does not need to be located in a city with a gas main. It needs only a supply of liquid fuel, air, and water. Again, whether this made it practical in any real-world sense is a question the record leaves unanswered, but the conceptual architecture is closer to later internal combustion engines that draw from a liquid tank than to the stationary gas engines tied to municipal infrastructure. Because of these features, later writers have sometimes been tempted to cast Perry's machine as a proto-closed cycle engine, or as a kind of missing link between the crude gas engines of the early 19th century and the sophisticated compression engines that followed. This is where caution is warranted. Closed cycle is a term with specific meanings in thermodynamics and in later engine development. It can refer to systems where the working fluid is recirculated rather than exhausted, or to arrangements where combustion is isolated from the power cylinder. Perry's patent does not describe anything so cleanly defined. He recycles heat through water, not the gases themselves. His exhaust still leaves the cylinder. To label his engine a closed-cycle design in the modern sense would be to overstate what the surviving documents support. The same caution applies to any suggestion of direct influence. There is no clear chain of evidence that Lenoir studied Perry or that Otto thumbed through U.S. patent number 4800 before sketching his own valve trains. Ideas in this period often surfaced in parallel, multiple inventors wrestling with similar problems, constrained by similar materials and fuels, arriving at overlapping solutions. What we can say without having to stretch is that Perry's engine occupies an interesting position on the curve, earlier than the famous gas engines, sharing concerns that would later become central and documented in a way that allows us to reconstruct those concerns in some detail. Part of the reason we can talk about him at all, rather than simply guessing that someone must have tried this, lies in the culture of patent models themselves. For much of the 19th century, the United States Patent Office required inventors to submit physical models along with their drawings and claims. These models were not miniature production machines. They were proof-of-concept objects, carefully built to show the essential principle of an invention at a manageable size. A patent examiner could pick one up, trace the path of a piston with a fingertip, see how a valve was intended to move. Those models then served a second life as public records of invention. They were displayed, at least intermittently, in the patent office and later in museum collections. A visitor wandering those galleries in the 1850s or 1860s could move from agricultural implements to sewing machines to experimental engines, each one distilled down to its mechanical essence. Commercial success was not a requirement for inclusion. The act of patenting and the submission of a model was enough. This is where Perry's story broadens beyond one engine. Even though his design did not seed an industry, the paperwork and the model meant that his technical ideas were fixed in a durable medium. Decades later, a cataloger at the United States National Museum could log gas engine model Stuart Perry, 1846, and summarize its operation. A 20th century historian could read that entry, cross-check it against patent number 4800, and recognize a water-cooled cylinder feeding its waste heat into a fuel retort. The machine itself may have been built only once, and may never have run for more than test intervals, but its architecture survives in text, and in that once present, now missing piece of hardware. Patent history, in this sense, becomes a kind of fossil record for engineering. Not every fossil belongs to the direct lineage of modern species. Many represent side branches, experiments that did not lead where we eventually went. But they still tell you what was possible at a given moment, what shapes were being tried, what combinations of features seemed promising. Perry's cold light engine is one of those fossils. It shows that by 1846, at least one inventor was thinking about internal combustion as a continuous, cooled, self-feeding process rather than as a one-shot explosion, and that he was willing to encapsulate that thinking in a model, send it to Washington, and trust that the system would remember even if the market did not. For a while, the system did remember, or at least it wrote Perry's model into its ledgers. If you trace the paper trail forward from patent number 4800, you eventually leave Perry's own century. You move past the period when the patent office itself kept towering racks of little wooden and brass constructions, and into the era when those models, hundreds of thousands of them, were being culled, transferred, and selectively saved. Somewhere along that route, Stuart Perry's engine leaves the inventor's hands and becomes an object in a national collection. The concrete clue we have is dry, bureaucratic, and oddly evocative. In 1939, the United States National Museum, what would later become part of the Smithsonian, published Bulletin 173, a catalog of its mechanical collections. Tucked among entries for pumps, turbines, textile machines, and locomotives is a listing that reads, in essence, gas engine model Stuart Perry, patented October 7th, 1846. That entry is compact, but it does more than just name an object. It gives dimensions, roughly 11 by 27 by 6 inches. It notes the double-acting horizontal cylinder, the water jacket, the use of heated platinum for ignition, and the way the waste heat from the cooling water is repurposed to vaporize fuel in a retort. It mentions that combustion continues only through about a third of the piston stroke. In other words, it is obviously describing the same architecture we have been reconstructing from the patent text itself. Between the patent drawings and the 1939 catalog, there is no sense of a ghost. The model existed. It sat on a shelf or in a case. A curator could walk up to it, tilt it, read the old patent office number attached to its base. A staff member in the Division of Engineering thought it worth the trouble to summarize its operating principle in that bulletin. Then the trail thins out. If you consult the modern object record for Perry's patent model at the National Museum of American History, you find a description that largely repeats the old catalog language. You get the same patent date, the same talk of a water-jacketed cylinder and platinum ignition, the same sense that this is a curiosity from the pre-Lenoir era. But you also see two telling phrases. not on display, and between the lines, location unknown. Based on the published records, the Smithsonian cannot currently point to a specific shelf, crate, or exhibit where Perry's little engine sits. It is in the books, but not in the building in any way that a researcher can readily verify. There is no accession note that says it was deaccessioned or destroyed. There is also no clear photograph, no modern conservation report, no contemporary scholar describing it from first-hand inspection. As far as the accessible documentation goes, the model was logged, its existence acknowledged, and then it slipped below the waterline of institutional memory. How does that happen to a unique artifact? The possibilities are less dramatic than theft in the night and more mundane, spread out over decades. In the late 19th century, when the Patent Office began shedding its massive model collection, tens of thousands of items were auctioned, discarded, or moved. Fires had already destroyed large portions of the holdings. Surviving models went through multiple rounds of triage. Some were transferred to the Smithsonian, some were kept in government storage, some migrated into private hands when officials decided they were redundant or of limited educational value. Within a museum, objects don't just sit. They are packed, unpacked, loaned, reboxed, moved from one storage building to another. Inventories are redone under new cataloging systems. Labels are updated. Classification schemes shift. A model that was once filed under experimental gas engines might a generation later be relabeled under patent models, miscellaneous, or obsolete power plants. Each of those shifts is an opportunity for a paper tag to fall off, a crate number to be miscopied, a reference to Perry S. to be shortened into something that no longer rings a bell. Layer on top of that the disruptions of the 20th century. War years brought budget pressures and changing priorities. Collections were consolidated, sometimes hurriedly. Space was made for new acquisitions by pushing older, less understood items deeper into storage. Different divisions were reorganized. The same model might have been under the purview of the patent division in one decade, the division of engineering in another, and some broader technology and culture collection after that. In each administrative shuffle, things could be misplaced without anyone consciously deciding to lose them. There is also the less comfortable possibility that Perry's engine left federal custody altogether. When surplus or duplicate models were disposed of, some were legitimately sold or given away. Others may have drifted into private collections through more informal channels, borrowed for an exhibition that was never fully reconciled or claimed as scrap value in an era when curatorial standards were looser. If that happened here, Perry's little double-acting cylinder might now be sitting on a shelf in someone's workshop, its original label long gone, its significance unrecognized. None of these scenarios is exotic. They are, in fact, the ordinary story of 19th century patent models and technical artifacts. The United States once held an almost unimaginably large physical archive of invention in miniature. Fires destroyed some of it outright. Auctions scattered thousands of models to dealers and collectors. Many pieces survived, but their documentation did not. Others are beautifully documented on paper, but the corresponding wood and brass has vanished. Drawings and descriptions flowed one way, physical objects another, and the two streams do not always rejoin. That separation matters more than it might seem. When you read a patent or a catalog entry, you encounter an invention in the tidy language its creator or curator chose. A model adds all the untidy parts back in. It shows you clearances, fastenings, the way a linkage actually has to bend to avoid another part. It can reveal shortcuts the inventor took or compromises they made when translating a diagram into hardware. For historians of engineering, those details can overturn assumptions or open new lines of questioning. In Perry's case, a rediscovered model could do exactly that. It could confirm whether his fuel retort was built as drawn or modified for practical reasons. It might show how he proposed to drive valves on a double-acting cylinder, something only sketched in the patent. Traces of wear on bearing surfaces could hint at whether the thing ever ran for more than a demonstration. Even the workmanship itself would tell us something about how seriously Perry, or the model maker he hired, regarded this engine. Was it a rough demonstrator, or a carefully finished piece intended to impress an examiner? Beyond the technical curiosities, there is the symbolic weight. Pulling Perry's engine out of a crate after 80 or 100 unseen years would not suddenly rewrite the history of the internal combustion engine, but it would sharpen one of its faint outlines. It would turn a paper design and a catalog paragraph back into a tangible object. That in turn might nudge more attention toward the whole pre-Lenoir, pre-Otto landscape of gas engines, an era that is often flattened into a handful of names because their machines happen to have survived in metal rather than just on paper. Instead, we are left with a gap, a patent, a paragraph from 1939, and the knowledge that somewhere along the line, an 11-inch model went missing in the maze of bureaucracy, storage racks, and human decisions. Whether it still exists at all is an open question. Whether it could be recognized if it sat unlabeled among a row of anonymous patent models is another. So the mystery lingers. Did Perry's cold light engine model burn in a fire, dissolve into some wartime scrap heap, slip quietly into a private collection, or does it still wait, mislabeled, in a dark cabinet a few miles from the capital where it first arrived? I'd like to hear what you think. If you enjoyed exploring this forgotten corner of engineering history, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more deep dives into strange old machines, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you think became of Stuart Perry's vanished engine.